Okay, so fortunately I can save time by not showing any pictures of Mary in her Joan Baez phase in the 1970s. Although,
are you going to save us from that?
Yeah, I am. Although I understand that Harlan Spence goes around to meetings showing one of those pictures. Yes, from my days at Aerospace, working with Pollacus and Blake. Okay, so I have gone way to the end here. Yes, but so I had the good fortune of working with Charlie Kennel in the same time frame, a little bit later that Richard described. But at that time, Charlie was having his first three students, Joe Kendall, Kinley, and myself, work on ionospheric problems. And then I got big time into MI coupling when I went up to Berkeley to work with Forrest Moser's group. And we were there for the S33 Satellite Days, which was really the heydays of many discoveries in MI coupling. So I didn't get back to the radiation belts until the Kress era. That was just a very exciting time because we realized that this picture is completely, wrong because it shows these very static radiation belts. And instead, we have now this view 2 solar cycles after Kress in much more detail of the dynamic radiation belts. This is the figure that Dan Baker showed earlier, but extended in an important way. This extends out. This is the 4.5 MeV energy channel of the REPT instrument. This shows the storage ring and so forth that Dan described. But I asked Jerry Goldstein to extend the Plasmapause line, and I would not call his a crappy model, as he called last night, because it's been compared against the emphasis data once the wave instrument was turned on, and it's a very good comparison. And this extension shows you how deep the Plasmapause incursion was right before the enhancement on October 9th that Richard described. What I'm going to focus on first are these 3 flux dropouts that were associated with CME shock, impact of the magnetopause, and simulations of those effects. And in particular, these 2, as Dan described, basically bookend the storage ring. And this third one really completely flushed out the outer zone so that the acceleration process on October 9th had to really start from scratch. This is the blow-up of the month of March that both Dan and Zhao showed, and I'm going to come back and talk about the dropout event in more detail than Zhao showed for March 17th. So what we are doing are 3D electron test particle simulations in MHD fields. And for the October 8th event results I'll show you, we followed electron dynamics in LFM RCM fields. So the Lyon-Fetter-Mowberry global MHD code has been coupled to the Rice convection model to more faithfully include the drift physics of the ring current, which has an effect on the location of the magnetopause and therefore the flux dropouts. And the plots that I'll show you of the flux that can be compared with REPT uses an ESA average model to weight the test particles that came from the Kress days. And the simulations I'll show you are full 3D test particle simulations with equatorial pitch angles ranging from 0 to 180 degrees. The first simulations we did of these events didn't cover the full range of pitch angles, and there's an interesting effect I'll point out near the end when you include the full range parallel to the magnetic field. So the result we find is that energy and pitch angle dependent loss occurs as the magnetopause moves inward, and you'll see that there's greater loss at higher energies and at 90-degree pitch angles, as you would expect for magnetopause shadowing losses. And that type of loss extends inside the orbit of the Van Allen probes on a time scale of 1 to 2 hours, although it is very abrupt if the magnetopause moves in abruptly. And this part of the results appears in a recent GRL part of the Van Allen probe special issue. Okay, so here we're making a comparison for those three magnetopause incursion events, the three CME shocks in September and October, the first 40 days of the Van Allen probe mission. And here you see a calculation of the LFM-RCM magnetopause location in black with the much used SHU empirical model in red. And you see that the comparison is very good for these three event periods. And in fact, when we initially did these first two simulations, we did not include coupling to the RCM model, and the comparison was not as good. So it has become our workhorse now to use the LFM-RCM coupled model for these types of studies. So I'm going to then focus mainly now on October 9th, which is this predecessor interval when the outer zone was really flushed of all electrons, sort of a rebooting of the outer zone before the acceleration processes that Richard described. So this is the figure that Zhao showed, and I'll just go through it in a little bit more detail and then show you a similar figure for the March 17th storm. So the black line shows the location of the magnetopause as determined from LFM-RCM. And you see this rapid inward motion of the magnetopause coincides with the arrival of the interplanetary shock seen down here in the solar wind data, which is used to drive the MHD code. And the losses penetrate to lower, they're deeper. This will be even more extreme for the March event at higher energies. And then the other way we have to examine the losses is to look at the pitch angle distributions, as Dan described. And you see that you get greater loss at 90-degree pitch angles at higher energies, which again is exactly what you would expect for magnetopause shadowing. And I think that's about it for this one, which has been published. So I'll let you take a look at this one in the published article and come back and spend more time on the March 17th event. This shows the ULF Wave Power, which you can, of course, calculate from the MHD code. And the top panel is a plot of power as a function of L from 1 to 10 millihertz over the time interval here on October 8th and 9th. And the bottom panel shows the frequency integrated over L, so integrated over the L range in panel A. And so you see that there is power, there's power on the 8th of October, and I'll show you a radial, I'll show you a sequence of slices because it's easier to see in the sequence of linear plots than it is on this color scale. That there's power prior to the arrival of the shock, there's a power after the arrival of the shock, it gets enhanced, and there's actually more power over here on the 9th, which you see also here as a function of L. And ULF wave power in this frequency range is exactly the right range for drift resonance with electrons in the 1 MeV or slightly lower range. And so this is just a plot of drift periods of electrons as a drift frequency as a function of L. And so I picked out an MeV here, which corresponds to this frequency range right here. So these ULF waves will produce radial transport, but now we have the reverse effect. When you have the sudden incursion of the magnetopause, you create a reversal in the normal radial gradient. And so the ULF waves will cause and contribute to outward radial transport. And I think, again, that's going to be clearer for the March 17th event, where the ULF wave power is stronger. Here are radial cuts as promised right after the shock arrived. And so you see a lot of power out around the magnetopause that was evident in the previous view graph. And again, the magnetopause is fluctuating in and out, and so that's giving you that, a lot of that radial power. But you also see that the power penetrates into lower L values. And this would be a time for me to mention that we have a plasmasphere, the Gallagher KP parameterized plasmasphere, embedded in the MHD model, and so it contributes to plasma density in the inner magnetosphere. And Seth Claudpierre gave a talk at AGU that he's writing up, where he did a more parameterized study rather than just doing an event study to look at how ULF Wave Power gets focused in the region around the Plasmapause or just outside the Plasmapause, as you see here. So this next figure shows a reason for that focusing. This is from a paper by Brian Kress in 2007 using the same MHD code and 3D test particle code. But for purposes of just talking about the MHD results, this was for the Halloween storm that Dan mentioned. And this is two different snapshots, and this is like a topo map of the strength of the azimuthal electric field, which is what was plotted in those previous ULF wave plots I showed. And you see that the azimuthal electric field power gets concentrated. There's two reasons for that. One is just a focusing effect associated with the magnetic field topology because it's quasi-dipole, and the field lines are getting shorter here. And the other is partial reflection off of this embedded plasmasphere. And so the magnitudes for this particular storm of the ULF waves at lower L value were actually greater as the impulse propagated inward at lower L value. Okay, so now I'm going to go on and talk about this March 17th storm in more detail. And in particular, I'm going to focus again on the flux dropouts because that's something that I think we're modeling pretty well with the MHD code. This is a figure that Zhao showed, I think, or certainly one that she produced. And the thing that I wanted to point out, the bottom panel is from MagIce at 1,000 MeV per Gauss, so at lower energy, and the top panel is from REPT. And this flux dropout that occurred on March 17th is stronger at the higher energies than it is at the lower energies. And again, this is consistent with our understanding of magnetopause shadowing. And so we set out to try to model this flux dropout in the same way that we did for the September-October events. And so first of all, I'll just point out that, again, the MHD code is doing a good job of modeling the magnetopause incursion. This time, it actually comes in to a lower L value. It only came into about L equals 8 for the October 8th, 9th time interval. And there's the solar wind data at the bottom, so you can see the strong enhancement in solar wind dynamic pressure that is driving this event. Okay, so now here's the same type of trajectories in the equatorial plane, and I'm going to show you a movie of this one. You see a strong incursion of the magnetopause occurred with the arrival of the interplanetary shock. And again, you see that flux is eroded. So you can see here in the 2 to 5 MeV channel, it just drops like a stone in L value when the shock arrives. And the same thing is happening at the higher energies. If you look down again at the pitch angle data, you see that the loss is stronger at 90 degrees for the higher energy particles. Now, one thing I wanted to point out for this event that caught our attention is that you also see loss parallel to the magnetic field, so at 0 and 180 degrees. And there's a lot of fine detail that's associated with the continuing evolution of the solar wind dynamic pressure. So you have this big spike in pressure that occurs here, and that impacts the response of the radiation belts as well. You have a drop in pressure right here, and when you get that kind of drop in pressure, the magnetopause rebounds out, but the particles don't have time to fill that in, so they stay at their fairly reduced L levels. Although you've had some radial transport outward from the initial incursion of the magnetopause back here. Now, for the whole point of having my laptop here is to run this animation. So this is an animation then looking down on the equatorial plane of electrons at 2 to 6 MeV, and you see the magnetopause moving inward, and so electrons are lost then to the magnetopause. And if I run it long enough, you'll be able to see the brief outward expansion. There it is, and then we're coming just about to the end of the movie here. So electrons don't survive that. There's the outward expansion. They don't survive that incursion of the magnetopause that occurs when the shock arrives. Now, this is an interesting comparison between the two storms because the ULF wave power was, in fact, much stronger for the March 17th event than it was for 8 October. So you see the scale on E5 is going up to 30 millivolts per meter here, and I think it's only going up to 18 over here. And so we would again expect the ULF waves to play a role in causing outward radial transport. And let's see, if I go back to here, you can see with a trained eye that there is, it's this time interval that I focused on for the ULF wave power. And you can see that the flux does, in fact, move outward relative to its initial incursion or loss due to the incursion of the magnetopause. Okay, so we wanted to analyze or try to understand in particular the reason for this loss parallel to the magnetic field. And this may be, secondary certainly to the dramatic loss due to loss at the magnetopause. But we went in and we examined the azimuthal electric field, and during this time interval from about, this is the whole sweep from 4 UT on through to the 18th of March. And so here you have the arrival of the shock, and you see that there are fluctuations in the azimuthal electric field. So this is the minimum and the maximum, and so this is westward pointing, eastward pointing E phi. And these fluctuations in the azimuthal electric field are being driven by fluctuations in the solar wind. The time scale of these oscillations is longer than a characteristic ULF wave time scale that I showed you on the previous plot. So I asked my a recent PhD student, Iago Burrito, to run this particular event using a code that he, using the same MHD code, the same test particle code, but he has an algorithm for mapping the precipitation to 100 kilometers that he's used for other events. And so you see that there's precipitation loss, oscillations, and precipitation loss to the ionosphere. Just from the ULF waves alone, our code does not include the important effect of the whistlers and the EMIC waves at higher frequencies. But you are getting modulated precipitation to the ionosphere, which we think is responsible for the loss at 0 and 90 degrees that we see in our simulations. And he studied this for other events. So this, for example, was one in 2005. We did not have balloons. Robin Millen did not have balloons up in March. Alexa will be describing after me results from the 2 barrel balloon campaigns. But this was a predecessor campaign in 2005 where Iago simulated the ULF wave modulated precipitation, and I think Alexa may talk about some of that ULF wave modulation and precipitation that's seen by the balloons. And I think I'll skip them. The mechanism, it's worth at least mentioning. Why would ULF waves cause parallel precipitation to the atmosphere? When MHD only has perpendicular electric fields. And the answer to that is Fermis Mechanism for acceleration of cosmic rays by 2 mirrors moving closer to each other. So when you compress the magnetic field on the day side here, you shorten the length of the field lines, and so the mirrors are moving together, and that increases the parallel momentum of the electrons. And each one of these oscillations of 50 electron trajectories here corresponds to the ULF wave period of 8 millihertz that Iago simulated and that the balloon saw. And the red is when electrons are precipitated to the atmosphere. And so you see a burst with one enhancement of E phi or BZ, and then a burst with the next one, and a burst with the next one, and so on. I think, yeah, I didn't comment down here, that Iago even embeds the IGRF magnetic field model into LFM. So he captures the fact that you get most of your loss in the region of the South Atlantic anomaly for this type of precipitation events, which fortunately is the region that the barrel balloons are first being launched into. Of course, they set up a 360 array, as Alexa will describe. Okay, so I'll just go on to my conclusions. We've done simulations of electron flux loss for the 8 October, or electron flux for the 8 October 2012 storm in detail, and seen reproduced dropout into L equals 5.8. We do not produce dropout all the way into the plasmapause. And so there, clearly, the higher frequency waves that our model doesn't include, the chorus waves and EMIC waves are playing a role just outside the plasmapause. But the magnetopause compression does a very good job of explaining the bounding of the storage ring that Dan described, as well as these two later flux dropout events in October and in March. And the LFM-RCM shows the effect of the magnetopause inward motion, and it also gives us information on the ULF waves, which we will be comparing with the EFW instrument on Van Allen probes. And not included, once again, in our model is this erosion all the way in of flux all the way into L=3, which I share the general belief that this is due to higher frequency waves. And there's a nice paper just accepted for JGR by Wei Chao Tu, who does a 3D diffusion model that includes the Whistler loss outside the plasmapause for the October 8th event. And then, of course, we are not including the rapid local energization that Richard described and has published in his Nature paper. So I just want to thank these people down here, because a lot of people have contributed to this effort and having it up and running so that, okay, bang, the next event we're going to look at is 8 October 2013, because we're all geared up and ready to look at the next new exciting storm, and that's probably the next one we'll look at. And so Mike Wildberger and Frank Toffoletto got the dipole tilt LFM-RCM up and running as an operational code that we can use for all these events. And Jan Peral, who's here at this meeting, did the particles and fields analysis and also the March 17th simulations. And last but not least, Jerry Goldstein for his plasmapause model, which was very useful to us in the early days before we had the EFW data available to tell us the location of the plasmapause, and the ECT EFW teams for their fabulous data. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Questions to Mary? Yes, Margie?
I wonder if you could show one of the slides. I think it was the March 17th case with the pitch angle distribution where you pointed out the dropout.
Right.
Yeah. Now, that dropout doesn't occur for about 45 minutes. Why is there an enhancement at 90 degrees before? What's going on?
Where is there an, oh, you mean over here?
No, I meant
right there.
After, yeah. I mean, first you get
no, here's the shock right here.
Yeah.
And so here everything is as it was before the shock arrived, and the shock arrived, and bang, you immediately have a dropout.
I'm sorry, I see red. I think that's...
Oh, you're talking about this right here.
Yeah, there's a...
Yeah, you know, why is there that enhancement? Again, there are...
about 40 minutes.
Right, this is taken, I should have said, this is taken at a particular... L value right there. So the dotted line is where it's taken. And if you look right there, you can see that there is, evidence to my eye for some outward radial transport that's occurring right there. So this, you have to look at more than one L value, but there's definitely some flux from here was transported out to there. I can see it if nobody else can. And so, it doesn't surprise me that you would see that kind of variability. Right. And so you're asking why it takes this long to see blue? Okay. So this is integrated over local time. Is that correct, Jan? Yeah. So it's integrated over all local time. And so electrons have to drift around from the night. Some of them are lost immediately on the day side. Others have to drift around from the night side before they're lost. And so, it's not, it's not happening instantaneously for all electrons at all longitudes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Margie. Mm-hmm. Richard.
Okay, while you got that slide up,
yeah.
I have a couple of questions and a comment.
Yeah.
Well, one question and a comment. We've been trying to model the March storm too, and what we found is we cannot account for some of the pitch angle distributions near the loss cone. So we've been wondering, and we've looked at other data. We do find evidence on pose for relativistic electron precipitation.
Yeah.
And we also find evidence of protons being precipitated at the same time. So we think this is the signature of EMIC.
Sure.
EMIC waves were seen on the Val Allen probes during this storm. So maybe some of the losses you're showing here along the field could be due to EMIC waves.
Well, they're not in our code. So this is all
No,
simulation.
I'm talking about the data.
Right.
This is data, isn't it?
No, this is the simulation.
Oh, this is simulation.
Yes,
Oh.
yes. If it were data, Margaret would have no question about it.
Okay.
Modeling has really gotten to the place where we don't need data anymore, right? That's a bad comment. Because in space weather, I've been encouraging modeling papers for the last 5 or 6 years because I thought that people would publish modeling papers and then others would be able to use them and show and improve and all as we go along. So modeling is important, but let's not replace it. Your question, I thought you asked your question.
That was the comment. The question is this. You talk about the Fermi, the Fermi acceleration.
Yes.
During the time when the flux tube is pushed inwards, but you also get adiabatic increase in p perp.
Right. Yes.
And in fact, p perp goes up faster than p parallel, so you don't actually
Well, so let me show you.
scatter the particles towards the loss cone. You scatter them away from the loss cone.
Let me show you this. So that exact question was asked by Robin Millen of Iago on his, for his thesis defense. And so this is a plot of the loss cone as a function of L, for I think, and it's for particles of, well, it's just, yeah, that's just the loss cone as a function of L using a dipole model. And then this is a radial transport conserving first and second invariant for two different electrons, which are crossing into the loss cone. Yes, they're gaining perpendicular energy, but they're crossing into the loss cone. So another thing that's happening at the same time is that you have radial transport going on, which is pushing electrons into the loss cone. But if you look at Iago's GRL paper, he compares the effect on p parallel and the effect on p perp, and there is an effect on p parallel for those electrons down here in the bottom corner because they are most definitely lost. They wind up in the loss cone. Yeah.
Okay, time for one more question. Okay, if not, thank you again, Mary.